Hello, everybody. Welcome to HR Profile's 5th webinar of our 2016 series. If anybody has any trouble hearing me or seeing anything, please send me a message in the chat box. But we just want to let you know that HR Profile is committed to partnering with and supporting the human resources community. We do so and provide these sessions to help round out your education, connect you with valuable resources, and on top it off, we provide you with some SHRM and HRCI credits. My name is Sonia McLaughlin, and I'm the client advocate here at HR Profile and your facilitator for today's webinar. Looks like we've got folks on the line from about 13 different states and even Canada. So that's nice that you all are here. Thanks for joining us. Did you all know that your diversity and inclusion program is not only an important factor in the eyes of the EEOC, but that companies benefit tremendously by building a diverse workforce? Today we're going to learn all about diversity and inclusion and how, with more and more advancing technology, the tools and data available to the HR industry, incorporating a D&I program is easier and more important than ever. The key takeaways from today's presentation are going to be understanding the shift from one-dimensional diversity to multidimensional inclusiveness, how to set your business up for talent management success through proper job modeling, and how easy and effective it is to use selection and development tools to build an inclusive culture. Today we're hosting Chris Leech as our presenter. Chris is Vice President of Sales and Marketing from the Devine Group. Chris has spent more than 15 years working in the human capital management industry. During that time, he assisted in optimizing talent strategies for organizations like Citigroup, IBM, Eli Lilly, DuPont, Best Buy, Cardinal Health, Target Stores, Sutter Health, and hundreds of other clients. Chris earned his bachelor's degree from Anderson University and his MBA from the Falls School of Business. And in addition to his leadership position with the Devine Group, Chris teaches as an adjunct professor of managerial economics for Anderson University Professional MBA program. We are very appreciative that Chris is here today with us. Before I hand it over to him, just a little bit of housekeeping. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. And at the end of the webinar, we'll go over some questions and answers and any other information. So then, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris. Here you go, Chris.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to thank HR Profiles and Sonia for putting this webinar series together, putting today's session together. Thank each of you for attending, and hope the information we're able to provide today is informative and useful. Kind of just to go over our outline, we're going to discuss today a little bit more about the definitions of diversity and inclusiveness, or at least how we're viewing diversity and inclusiveness in today's conversation, so you can get understanding that, because it's a pretty broad area. We're going to talk about some of the generational shifts and how that's impacting organizations and how organizations are viewing diversity and inclusiveness and how to support a more inclusive culture. We're going to talk about a case for inclusiveness from more of a business case standpoint. The various different data measurements that are out there. So how do you take some of these definitions and make them actionable using HR analytics and some of the development of measuring tools over the last decade or so. And then we're going to talk about aggregating that data up to help you understand how your business or various different parts of your business are supporting an inclusive culture. And towards the end, as Sonia mentioned, we'll have some time for question and answer. So starting out, I want to take a look at what's diversity. I mean, obviously there's some very tight definitions around diversity from a government or regulatory standpoint, but diversity, and especially when you add in the inclusiveness side of diversity, it really is starting to expand out into a broader conversation, which actually makes it a little bit more difficult to define and a little bit more difficult in a lot of people's minds to measure. But there are some definite quantitative ways to get that done. So if we look a little deeper at the definition, the EEOC has always had a fairly tight definition around diversity that a lot of regulations around. So it is various different minority groups of people by race, color, religion, sex, national orientation, disability, etc. And that is still incredibly important. There's a lot of regulation around that. There's a lot of strategy around how to make a more diverse organization. But we want to expand out the definition a little bit, and some of the things that have changed in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years that can move it a bit from more that one-dimensional to a multi-dimensional inclusiveness. So it's more of an expansion of that definition of diversity. And a lot of organizations are seeing the value of thinking differently and using different problem-solving backgrounds. And having an open, more open-minded perspective of thinking differently and having different problem-solving backgrounds starts to bring in that definition of inclusiveness. Now, these end up tying together in that if you're more open to thinking differently, looking at different ways to problem-solve things, you're typically more open to being collaborative with colleagues and being open to learning from different backgrounds of people. So these all kind of tend to tie together, but instead of being a tighter definition around that actually individual person, it is expanding out to be a little bit more of a thought process and inclusiveness of thought. And a lot of organizations are moving this for a number of different reasons. But as businesses, we have obviously a clearly changing demographic within the United States and globally. But within the United States, demographics changing, buying behaviors are changing, so organizations need to be able to match to those buying behaviors. So if you're building products, if you're innovating for new solutions, if you're developing customer service teams that need to service a changing demographic of buyers, you certainly have to bring in people in your organization that can think far more broadly and openly to match all that changing buying behavior. So there's a business driver on the buying side, and a lot of that is so organizations can innovate. Innovation's a big key driver of this, but it's also, and part of that innovation is avoiding the group think. So there's a lot of conversation around there. You know, if you don't have people that are open to inclusiveness and diversity of problem solving, you're going to get a lot of group think in your business, which can really hurt you down the road strategically from the innovation side. But there's also another big driver, in addition just the changing diverse landscape and demographic of buyers and organizations trying to drive towards innovation. And it really is down the road and looking at some of the changing of the different generations. So in our next slide, we'll look at what I call the millennial shift. Diversity and inclusiveness today is being defined or being broadened a lot by the change of generation, especially the millennial generation. And while we still, I shouldn't say instead, it really is in addition to the government definitions, which are still incredibly important. But a couple different stats here. When defining diversity, millennials are 35% more likely to focus on unique experiences, whereas previous generations are more focused on representation. And that kind of goes back to the previous slide of looking at an EEOC definition representation as opposed to diversity of thought. When asked about the business impact of diversity, millennials are 71% more likely to focus on teamwork, compared to 28% of non-millennials. And millennials believe that programs aimed at diversity and inclusion should focus on improved business opportunity and outcomes as a result of the acceptance of cognitive diversity, specifically individualism, collaboration, teamwork, and innovation. So you can see the words that are used from the millennial perspective are quite a bit different than the representation perspective that has been the previous and current definition for a few decades now. One of the things too that's driving a lot of this, because the millennials obviously are moving into the workforce, they're a very, very large population in the workforce, and you know, if you look at, they're the first generation to enter the workforce that are truly digital natives, and previously all the other generations are digital immigrants. And when looking at their perspective of diversity and inclusiveness, it is so much more broad because they've grown up in a much more broad world of social media and the ease of connecting with people all around the country or all around the world. They didn't grow up just with their neighborhoods and schools as the people they connect with. It is technology has taken all those barriers and down. You know, a small story, my son now, he's a millennial and he's in college, but you know, he would be, you know, he's in high school and junior high, he'd come downstairs and he'd been on Xbox Live, and he talked to me about how he's, you know, chatting with somebody up in Toronto or chatting with somebody over in California. So during, you know, their time on the computer, social media, even gaming, they're connecting with people from all over the world. So it really has caused millennials to enter the workforce to have very different expectations about collaboration, teamwork, openness of thought. So in addition to the changing buying behaviors due to the changing demographics out in the world, we also have obviously a different buying behavior from the millennials moving into active buyers. We also have a whole influx of talent coming into the business that thinks very differently. And as millennials get into an organization, if they enter a culture that isn't open, collaborative, they're gonna soon leave. And you know, the retention rates on the millennial generation is quite a bit lower anyhow, because they move around quite a bit. A lot of that from the expectation of them coming out of the workforce into a very tough labor economy, so their loyalty to organizations is low. But another big component of it is the culture of that organization. It's very, very important in millennials. So we've had a big shift in not only the changing of the buying behaviors, but also the changing of talent coming into the business, which is setting up you know, a strong reason to support setting up a diverse and inclusive program within your business. But in looking at a business case on it, in addition to the change in the definition or shift in the definition, and also in the change of people coming into the business from a generational shift, and there's a number of different business cases for this, but this is one from Burson by Deloitte. They do tons of great research, so go look them up and study any of the cases they have out there. But 454 organizations were surveyed, and these organizations are all around $750 million and above, so you know, large, mid-sized to very large organizations. But the ones that had mature talent strategies had a 2.3 times higher cash flow. Now they took those organizations and broke them down into kind of 3 tranches, and the bottom 70% of respondents really didn't have a mature talent management strategy. So you know, clearly this large organizations, 70% still don't. There's a lot of room for improvement in corporate America across the board. But of the top 30%, they broke it into 2 groups. 19% had a relative clear database talent management strategy. So obviously they probably had strong technologies, strong identification of the people that were in their business, and were tracking these things. So that put them into that category where they got a much higher cash flow. But then the study really focused in on the top 10%. And the difference for those businesses is they had a widespread and integrated talent strategies that incorporated the importance of inclusiveness. And the quote that I have getting ready to display here, I think really kind of summarizes very well what exactly those 10% were doing. Organizations that built these high-impact diversity and inclusive strategies and practices strive to create a conversation, a relationship with employees, which communicates to them that they are fully understood and valued by the organization. This relationship also encourages employees to contribute their whole range of experiences and perspectives. So that really kind of ties together. That's when the vice president is doing the research there. That really ties together all the different slides that we kind of just talked about over the definition, over so what some of the things the millennials are focused upon, and this case study really shows how those top 10% of those organizations did that. So with that information provided, it's a lot of times people will say, oh, well, okay, but now what? I've read a lot of that, but the challenge we're having is trying to figure out what do you do with that? How do you move something so as intangible as that into a business? And how do you measure it and how do you improve it? So that's what we want to focus in a little bit today, is some of the measurables that are now available in business due to advancing technologies. Many of you have probably been exposed to or might have used assessment tools in the past. And assessment tools have changed quite a bit over the last couple of decades, and I'd say really over the last 5 to 10 years. And a lot of these assessment tools are now able to measure very accurately a series of behaviors. So, common assessment tools may have a 20 or 30-minute assessment at a larger professional level, or a 10 to 15-minute assessment at an hourly level, and really looks at what are the natural behaviors for people. And this is a sample of an assessment that has 33 different behaviors that are measured. So, you can obviously, I'm not going to go through each of these. There are a number of different strong assessment tools out there, but you want to make sure that they have a lot of years of research behind them. They're fully validated tools. But once you're able to properly measure true behavior information on people, it then allows you to then build that information in the building blocks that starts to work us towards some of the things we're discussing here today. So one of the more recent changes in some of these assessment tools has been moving from just a pure behavioral tool that's sometimes kind of hard to relate to a particular job or a particular organization, and group those behaviors into competencies. So here's kind of an example of the 33 different behaviors now listed on the left-hand side. You can then take anywhere from a couple to maybe 7 or 8 of those behaviors, subgrouping of them, and build them into true job competencies. And that is really kind of the key that a lot of organizations haven't quite worked towards. But when you're able to have an assessment that has done this, you can start to do a lot of different things with the data across the organization, from hiring, development, team reports, and some of the things we're going to discuss here in a minute. But as an example, on the bottom here, managing relationships, a particular competency involved in a lot of any supervisor or leadership type positions. And it is simply a group scoring with proper weightings on it, so these tools take a long time to develop, of conflict management, emotional composure, empathy, listening, negotiating, competitive style, and communications. So I just wanted to set the stage before we start to talk about how do you incorporate diversity and inclusiveness and measuring inclusiveness into these tools, understand what kind of tools are being used to do this, because the word assessment, the word HR analytics, the word people analytics is so broad, but a lot of these tools have been around for many years, but they really have advanced to do proper job modeling and measure these kind of soft skills in a way that they never had in the past. So now to bring it back, now I understand that the tools being used to do some of the measurement, bring it back to today's conversation. Diversity and inclusive competencies. Job models can incorporate various different competencies that are essential for an inclusive and diverse work environment. Here's a few samples, but leverages diversity, objectivity, collaboration, recognizes others, interpersonal relationships, self-awareness, develops people, just a handful of competencies that are measuring soft skills through a roll-up of the behaviors. As you can start to think about, if you're able to understand how people measure or fall into these areas, you could start to get an idea of whether you're developing or not developing in an inclusive culture. And as we discussed in our kind of definitions and some of the work environment millennials are expecting, collaborative teamwork environments and all those type things drive that inclusiveness of thought, drive that accepting of others, and drive that innovation that businesses are looking for. Moving to the next slide. So we have a good idea of some definitions in this particular case for diversity and inclusiveness. And we now have an idea of the base type tools used to measure them. But how do you really take this into action? And so that's where we're going to spend a little bit of time here for the remainder of our session, really talking about how we build these into job models, and then how can you use those job models and that data in an aggregate view to start looking at inclusiveness across the business. So one of the important parts of this is building job models. So a lot of business are going through this process of setting up job descriptions and building competency-based job models. And there's a number of different ways you can go about doing that, but it's really the process of which a set of competencies is developed, which delineates the knowledge, skills, and attributes required for successful performance. Some organizations are sitting down building these from kind of the ground up based on job descriptions and getting input from subject matter experts. Some organizations are partnering with organizations that may already have a base library of many, many different job positions already built, and then they can just maybe use the uniqueness of the job descriptions for those individual companies to map some various other different competencies. If you're a larger organization, you might be able to do a benchmark study or a validation study for that exact role. Benchmark study is a little bit of a smaller study in where you're looking at high and low performers, asking them to take the assessment of the current job model, and then you can run statistical models to see which competencies seem to be the most important, which behavior is most important, what kind of weightings. And then a full validity study, which is a criterion validity study for that exact job for that exact company, really kind of takes it to that highest level. Some larger organizations are able to do that, but the technology has advanced so much in the assessment and analytics space that the validity studies for that exact job aren't required at the levels that might have been 10, 20 years ago. All the tools are validated. Whether you're working with the library models, doing a benchmark, or adding a validity study, that's really just fine-tuning that tool a little bit to your exact position within your exact role. But the tools can still be very, very predictive and really help the business even with some of the models that are already built. But moving from to the next slide here, beyond building job models, which is incredibly important to have them built, and it's very important to have them competency-based. But then another equally important piece, if you're going to start including inclusiveness competencies, is how the tool itself is measuring those job models. So you need to do it properly to take this to the next level. It's great to have job-specific models built that are predictive for those exact jobs. But one of the things, if you want to start to bring in some of these other inclusive competencies that may not be specific to that exact job, but may be important to your business as a culture. One of the strongest ways to do this is to make sure you're separating them out within the report output from the assessment. So you could have your primary competencies, oftentimes 4 to 8 competencies, which are very position specific, whether you're a nurse, accountant, customer service worker. They're very specific to that job. And the roll-up on the selection side of those scores can actually provide a predictive output of recommend, highly recommend, do not recommend type thing. But then you can have a secondary set of competencies which do measure a lot of these other very important competencies for the business overall, but may not impact or does not impact the recommendation level on the selection side. If you start to incorporate a lot of these other competencies into the primary and the scoring of recommendations of the selection report and assessment, it can start to dilute that, and it becomes less predictive for that specific role. So it really depends upon how you want to use these type selection tools. But this becomes a very strong way to do it is have your recommendation levels built off the exact job competencies, have a secondary set of competencies measured. You get to have an understanding of how that person fits into some of the diversity, inclusiveness, and cultural values you're driving within your business. So to take this to a little bit more specific example, we have on the next page what it might look like for an IT manager. So the primary competencies of somebody in IT management, plans activities, manages resources, directing others, executing for results, problem solving, time management, takes action, all very standard business competencies. You may have a couple other secondary competencies that are related to that role of innovative thinking and project management. But when we go to include new competencies that are around inclusiveness, around some of the cultural things you're trying to drive, you'll see we're going to add here a new subset. And you can add in collaboration, leverages diversity, recognizing others, develops others. Really need to sit down with your provider and look at what is it that you want to measure across the business. So you could have a secondary group of competencies here that are measured across all supervisor positions, or maybe all hires in company in general. It's just really depending upon how you want to do it with your business, what areas you're wanting to measure, what areas you're wanting to drive. And so this becomes maybe important in your overall evaluation process from a selection side. Obviously, you have an assessment, you have an interview, you have years of experience with the resume. There's lots of things you need to look at in a hiring process. But this just adds one more piece of information. The other thing that can be nice is beyond the selection side, but in developing your organization, you can have these pieces in here, and you can have development reports, coaching reports for the manager to help employees develop in these areas. So sitting down and getting job models defined for very important roles in the business, or all roles, maybe looking to incorporate some soft skill competencies that help build the culture, and putting those in for selection and development and coaching in the business can very clearly start to impact and bring in many of the things we're discussing from an objective criteria standpoint built off of analytical tools. But one of the things that you can do once you do have these type things in place, and it's far easier than many people would think. 10, 20 years ago, you'd have to bring in a lot of consulting, many-month projects. The assessment tools and the models already available can be put in place pretty quickly in comparison to some of the programs you might have looked at in the past. But if you take this information, so let's just say gone through this process, you now have individual reports from a selection development side, but if you start to aggregate some of this data up, as we'll see on the next slide here, you can start to get an idea of how this can be used. And this is where you might say we're kind of moving into some HR, and kind of data analytics, and looking at things from an aggregate point of view. Some of the things that can be done beyond the individual selection and development side is you can also start to look at this for succession. So if you have an individual contributor role for IT, and then you're looking at across the people in the team who would fit in well for an IT managed position, the tools are available now just through a few clicks. You take the original assessment data and you remap it to a new job model, and allows you to very quickly see how that person might fit in for succession planning. And that could be done a lot of different ways, department to department, or kind of up and down the line. If you want to roll that, say you've had 10 or 12 people in a particular team, whether it's an IT team or sales team or a leadership team, you can roll those up into a team reports view and start to look at the strengths and opportunities for development on a team level. This can be, incredibly beneficial if you're trying to put large project teams together that may be from different departments, and you don't really have a clear understanding of how those various different people are going to work together because they haven't in the past. So you could grab those individuals, roll them into some team reports, and really start to look at a behavioral level and some of the common competencies, how people are going to fit in, and maybe you have an imbalance in some of those teams. So it could be a useful tool that way. Roll that up to their leadership level. Again, team reports at a leadership level. We've had a number of examples of organizations that might have come to us and said, we're having a particular challenge in this particular leadership team. Maybe it's trust or some of those type things, and we can roll that data up and do a leadership analysis to see, and obviously when you get very complex personalities, many of them hard drivers, having that kind of leadership viewpoint from a soft skill side can be very telling, and then can allow maybe some in organization development to come in and really assist that team. But one of the areas that I think really gets kind of neat with this data, and we start to look at diversity and inclusiveness, and it's rolling all the company data up into a culture report. And at that time, you're really aggregating it. So everybody in the organization has to have taken the assessment, whether they took it when they're coming on board for selection or you gave it to them for development purposes. But you can roll all that data up, and you can, obviously all the names come off of it, and it really just becomes an aggregate view of the 33 core behaviors and then various different competencies. You can map that to different competencies, but if you're wanting to look at your culture, inclusive collaboration, team, all the different competencies around inclusion, you can start to get a benchmark understanding of where your organization currently stands. From a total company standpoint, you can do it for divisions and you can do it for teams. So you really, once you have that measurement and understanding of your business, that's when you can start to, hire and select people in that may move that positively forward or not. And it can also become a factor in how you're doing development of certain teams. Maybe certain teams, just because they're very individualistic in nature, haven't learned to collaborate that way. But those are development opportunities. You can really help people and start to look at the data very differently. And this is when you start to say, okay, I'm moving an individual assessment. So a lot of people think, okay, take a test to see if you should hire or not. And you start to roll that information up into people analytics and start to look at organizations in totality. And there really is one last area here before we kind of get to some question and answer that you can look at that a lot of people, again, which I just mentioned, look at assessments from an individual standpoint, and they also oftentimes look at it as a moment in time. So, I use this assessment to hire salespeople only, and then I use this other assessment for leadership development only, and then I have 360 tool over here. And while that's good that maybe organizations embrace using some of these tools to help with their talent management, the piece that's missing is the commonality of language. So once you've set up proper job models with proper competencies, you can use those same tools across the entire employee life cycle. So an original selection assessment is used, and then coaching reports can be pulled for onboarding, development reports can be pulled for development. You can roll that data up and look at team and culture reports. You can use it for succession planning. 360s can be used that are competency-based, and as long as you're using all the same competencies across the business. The previous slide we talked about using, kind of HR analytics at an aggregate level. I think what we do with this is also show it can also be done along the entire employee life cycle. And then you have engagement reports that can be used at an aggregate level. And engagement reports are more of a survey, and the culture reports we just discussed are an aggregate of true measured soft skills. So both can be done and can be important. And even exit surveys can be done to find out, okay, are we not getting there? And obviously exit surveys can help with information on compensation and lots of different things, but it also could help identify areas where the culture was deficient in order to help retain that person. So I think not only do we have aggregate type reports, but also making sure you're using this data along the entire employee continuum. And when you roll that data up both ways and use it both ways, and you can start to also look at trends of that data, that's when you're truly moving into people and HR analytics. And through the use of incorporating the inclusiveness competency sets, you can add beyond just a performance-based perspective of predicting performance. You're also adding in a full total cultural perspective. So in kind of summary here, before we go to question and answer, looking at diversity and inclusiveness, adding in diversity of thought, understanding there are tools out there that can accurately measure the soft skills of collaboration and a lot of those inclusiveness competencies, building proper job models. So as you are measuring this information, you're not diluting the predictiveness and importance of the selection and development tools for those individual jobs, and then looking at that data not just from an individual standpoint, but a collective standpoint, and also not looking at that data from a moment of time, but using that data across the entire employee spectrum, and also looking for trend information as how the business is moving positively or not in a cultural perspective. All those things can be done at a much, much easier level than they could have even 10 years ago due to some of the recent advances in technology here. So Sonia, if you like, we could open up for some questions, and hopefully, since we are moving into that phase, I want to thank everybody for their attendance. Hope the information is informative.
Thank you so much, Chris. Absolutely, yeah, that was very interesting. Such a comprehensive approach, and how important it is for a company's business strategy to incorporate the diversity and inclusiveness. And I found that it was interesting, especially how it sounds really easy to incorporate those diversity and inclusiveness competencies into whatever program a company has right now. We do have some questions coming up, and if anybody else wants to add any, please feel free to add them in the question box. And if we don't get to them in the time that we have, then we'll follow up with you afterwards. And actually, Chris, I've got a question myself for you. Do you have any idea of how many companies or what percentage of companies are actively plugging in those D&I competencies into their whole program?
I unfortunately I don't, because they could be using a number of different tools in the market. I would say from just being in the business, it's a small percentage. As you can see from the survey, Burson survey, only 10% of those 464 organizations were using inclusiveness effectively in their business, and only 30% overall had a very strong talent-driven strategy. What you do have is a lot of organizations are using assessments and HR analytics, but a lot of them are still using them at an individual level or only at certain moments of time. And what a lot of those that have used them in that capacity are starting to realize, okay, there's a lot of different things we can do with this. So it's a topic of conversation with many organizations, but I'd say it's probably a smaller percentage that are doing it, and especially doing it working in the inclusiveness side.
Okay, okay. And really everyone should be incorporating that. So here's the first question. What would you say to companies that want to bring in younger generations but also need to balance their aging workforce?
Well, what you can do is one of the things we talked about is using this for selection, but also using it for development. So, a lot of times, especially employees have been in business for a long time or jobs for a long time, they've never really thought about, development in that way, or competencies in their jobs, or even measuring or being developed on collaboration competencies when they're, been in an accountant role working at their desk all day. So some of this is just education and realization and having somebody sit down and talk with them. So in order to bring in a lot of the younger generation, you do need to build an organization that is inclusive within, any age group and any diversity group of diverse people. But a lot of it can done on the development side too. So you could sit down with people that may have not thought about this way, and you start to have these conversations, and it broadens their mind and perspectives. So it is a balanced approach, and when you're looking at this entire topic, it applies to everybody.
All righty. And let's see, here's another one. What about current employees? What if current employees do not assess well on competencies but are very good performers?
And a lot of that comes down to the development side. So one of the things about current employees, they may be very strong in executing on that exact job because they've been doing it many years. And so they've learned to overcome some maybe natural behaviors that weren't perfectly designed for executing that job. And that's okay. That's even when you're hiring people. If they don't score perfectly in the assessment, but they have many years experience of doing it and they interview well, you still may hire them. This is one piece of information, one piece of the puzzle. But what you can do with that person is sit down and start to work on some of those areas of development. And when you're doing it, you may identify only one thing to work on for improvement. So it really does become the proper coaching. That person's fantastic in their individual job, but maybe you want to coach them in some of these soft skills just to help them within their total team environment or business environment. And if you look at the statistics out there, employees enjoy being developed and getting that kind of attention from their organization. It really helps them feel valued, so it works out well all the way around.
Excellent. All righty, here's another one for you. Those last reports look very transparent. Do you have issues with senior leadership adoption?
There can be at times. So, your C-suite, your CEO, president, or divisional leaders oftentimes have to be a bit progressive really to grab HR analytics and maybe even take the assessment themselves, or their leadership team take the assessment themselves, because not always is the information as pleasant as you would like. But there's certainly ways you can jump into it. You don't have to put all this in place at once. A lot of organizations will start with key roles they have for a lot of hiring, or if they want to look at team reports for the first time, they may look at project teams or sales teams. And once senior leaders start to see the very interesting information and data that comes out of this and start to see successes in certain areas using these kind of instruments, it ends up expanding into the rest of the business. So as an HR leader, you may be looking at going, okay, how would I get my C-suite to totally embrace this kind of thing? It can be done through stepping stones. Now, if you have progressive leaders, some of them really want to move fast with it because it is so powerful. But if you have some others that are maybe a little bit cynical, or, truthfully, there are some assessment tools out there that aren't all that strong, or if they looked at them 10, 15 years ago, they've advanced so much more now. You can start out with some small areas of importance in your business and get them adopted over time.
That sounds like a good plan. Let's see, here's another one. What can we convey to the company to justify spending extra time and money to set up a program?
Well, and that's where, right, the return on investment is always an important piece. And what we spoke about today was developing inclusive culture in those larger business cases. I understand that sometimes you have a senior leadership, CFOs, that want to see, a more immediate return than that in order to justify some of the costs of these tools. So there's other areas that these tools can benefit beyond what we discussed here. It could be reduction of turnover, improvement of performance for teams. There's lots of different areas, maybe a reduction in workplace violence, a reduction in shrinkage or terminations due to theft. And there's really many different areas out there that assessment tools can come in and impact. And also you can build in, as we showed, an area to also start to measure inclusiveness. So the return on investment can be calculated a number of different ways, some much more direct in the business. But the last piece I'd also mention is the cost of these kind of tools has come down quite a bit in the last 5 to 10 years. As technology is able to move in and really drive a lot of this, the return on investment is becoming far, far easier to calculate with whichever provider you bring in.
All righty. Here's another question. How can the ATS systems be used by organizations to better align with inclusiveness? A lot of ATS systems are not scaled to be inclusive and often delete the talent that can change the dynamics of inclusiveness.
Yeah, that's a good question. In looking at an applicant tracking system, and a lot of assessment providers and tools out there do integrate into the applicant tracking system, in that you can have, and this is also an important point, I think maybe part of the question too, is on a selection side, the ideal is to assess everybody and not just assess maybe the finalist or the final couple people. And in the past, some of the pricing models of assessment tools made that kind of cost prohibitive. It's very difficult to assess everybody. But new models are now out there that are much more SaaS driven. So you can incorporate this assessment tool into the applicant process and assess all people. What that allows you to do is then use the assessment tool as part in relation to the resume and also the final interview to look at people, look at the predictive scores on the primary competencies, but also start to get a sense of those secondary competencies as well. So it really allows a much greater amount of data to be used to drive some of that inclusiveness and help shift the business a bit than what you might have been able to do in the past. So it's really incorporating this data and that selection report into that applicant tracking system. Now, obviously then post-hire, everything's really handled on the development side, but from an incorporation of an applicant tracking system, I think the big shift that allows people to see and use this data differently is being able to assess the entire applicant population as opposed to just kind of one-offs as it's been done in the past.
Excellent, thank you. And then looks like we've got one more question, and it's a good segue into my conclusion here. Are HRCI and SHRM credits available? So that is something that, both SHRM and HRCI credits have been applied for. We already have received the SHRM credits. HRCI are pending. I've got a program ID. So I will be getting that information out to everybody who has attended, as well as links to today's presentation and to our presenter, Chris Leech, and his company. So I think, let's see, We're going to have Chris's contact information, the certificates, the slides, and then before we wrap it up, just want to make sure that everybody knows that on top of lining up these informative webinars with the continuing education credits for you all, it's my job to make sure that there's no question in your mind that HR Profile, one of the nation's preeminent CRAs, consumer reporting agencies, is a valuable resource for you, from partnering with our clients and the HR community to educating you about the many misconceptions and loopholes that most people don't realize, to ultimately helping to keep your hiring program, your clients, your staff, your vendors, everyone in between, safe, compliant, and defensible by providing you with the highest and most thorough quality background checks and employment screening services. With that, and on behalf of all of us here at HR Profile, we sincerely thank you, Chris, for this great information, and thanks to all of you for attending today. Have a great rest of the week.